Ready to go. So thanks for being here. It's good to be with everybody this morning. I hope you had a good weekend. So what we're going to do over the next 5 days, right, it'll be about 20 minutes to a half hour each morning at 9 o'clock, is we're going to go through this presentation I put together for you about thriving through uncertainty. I want to give you a little bit of the background on it. So first is, so about 9 or 10 months ago, I started writing a book about change and how to process change, right? Because change is the thing that we go through the most. It's the one constant we have. And the name of the book is called The Codex of Change. And I'll talk to you a little bit about what a codex is in just a minute. And so what we're going to go through for the week are excerpts from the book, some personal experiences, some metaphors, a little bit of science. And basically, it's going to be able to hopefully give everybody some context to put change in. I mean, right now we're going through certainly hyper change. I've used this quote a lot, and it's just so appropriate, is that you go through decades of no change, and then you go through weeks with decades change. And basically that's where we are now. So this whole series will be really about helping give some perspective and be able to self-diagnose when we're presented with something uncomfortable or change, or maybe something that kind of gets us off balance a little bit. So that's what this is all about. And I've been really fortunate over the last, well, fortunate my whole life, but certainly over the last 25 years or so, where I've had some great teachers. I've had a lot of formal training and education in some of these matters. Years ago, it was always referred to as self-development, and now it's mindfulness, right? And so I've been really fortunate to have and receive training. I'm a level 2 Reiki, and I've done meditation and all those types of things. And I've also self-taught quite a bit. And as a lot of you guys who know me, know that I don't have a lot of hobbies. It's basically family work, and satisfying my curiosity. My curiosity is about self-learning. And this is all about how do we self-teach ourselves to navigate through a process, especially where in an environment like this where we've got a lot of change. And so we'll be using, I said, some science and metaphors and things like that. So today we're going to do a little bit of an introduction. A lot of the introduction is going to focus on curiosity, because without curiosity, we don't really have anything else. So if we're not curious about how things affect us or the things going on around us, then they lose some of their impact. So we'll be spending time on that and on curiosity. Spin up the PowerPoint properly here. And then we'll get into, tomorrow morning, we'll get into understanding you. How are you wired? We all come wired the same way from the factory. And then how do we adjust our wiring? And we'll spend time kind of understanding that in a kind of a historical sense, how we as a species have developed, and then how it impacts us in today's modern world versus more in antiquity. Then removing self-limiting beliefs, that's super fun. I can't wait to get to that. Being an observer. So on Thursday, we're going to talk about how to be an observer. So how do you go through events as an observer as opposed to being in judgment? And we'll spend a lot of time on that, because that's a very powerful skill to develop. And then lastly will be strategies to get moving. Now we've got all this information, what do we do with it? So let's talk next about codex. So a codex is a Greek word basically for manuscript. And what's so significant about a codex is a codex, or a manuscript, in of itself represents change, because up until about 1,500 years ago, everything was done on a scroll. And and so I kind of laughed, because if you think about it, right, people would, they'd have these huge scrolls, and that's what they wrote on, until one day somebody decided that hey, maybe we should put these all on individual pieces of paper, put them within a hard surface. All of a sudden it's a book. And so that's what a codex was. Okay, a codex was originally a book, a story. And of course, back then, 1,500 years ago, not everyone was educated in reading and writing. It was typically for the upper classes, nobles, clergy, things like that. So a codex or a book was of really great value. And if you can kind of picture this, now we've all been through a lot of technology changes, but if you can kind of picture this, that all of a sudden you've got, you know, let's say a group of monks in a monastery, and they're used to writing on scrolls, and all of a sudden somebody brings in this book. That was new technology. I mean, we don't look at a book as technology, but back then, that was technology. That was like the iPad of 1,500 years ago. So I chose the term codex specifically because it represents change. It also represents your story. So this is your codex. And so that's the process we're going to go through today and through the week, is how do we develop, you know, what's the process to develop your story? Because I can't tell you what to do. The person next to you can't tell you what to do. But what you can do is develop the tools and surround yourself with the right thinking and the right diagnostic process so that you can move through change and have it be seamless. So that's the reason why we have the word codex, is that codex in of itself represents change, because it was a change from scrolls to books. And like I said, I have this vision of monks or whatever, you know, being in the monastery and somebody presents them this new thing, which really for them would be equal to like an iPad. So that's where the name comes from. So now let's get into curiosity. So if you take a look at this picture, and I selected it for a reason, is that once you get above the clouds, there's sunshine. And so it's always about how do we get out of the clouds, the fog, until we get to where the sunshine is. That's what a lot about change is, right? Change is about going through a process in which you get out of the clouds and you'll be able to see everything clearly. There's another metaphor that I really like. I haven't used it here in writing, but it's also like when a jet breaks the sound barrier. The sound barrier is 761 miles an hour. And as a jet is approaching the sound barrier, it rattles, it shakes, it does all sorts of things. But once it punches through the sound barrier and gets smooth air, because what happens is before the jet approaches the sound barrier, a lot of pressure builds up on the airframe, on the wings and all that. And so it makes it make gyrations and all that. But the sonic boom you hear is that once it clears that, once it clears all that resistance, then it's smooth sailing. So you think about this as smooth sailing, you get above the clouds, it's a little bumpy as you go through the clouds, and then all of a sudden you're into the sunshine. And that's really what the change of process is that you are, by nature in change, you're basically leaving what you know for what you don't know. And there's kind of no easy way around that. That's just the fact, okay? Is that it doesn't mean that where you were was bad, and it doesn't mean where you're going is necessarily better or more dangerous. It's just different. And so when we leave a place that we were familiar with to someplace new, it is new, and it is somewhat unknown. And we don't fear change because of the future. We fear change because of our known past. So it's the experiences that we've had in the past that basically make us leery of what's coming up in the future. Because the way we're all wired, and we're all wired the same way. And so you hear people say about, well, you know, we gotta rewire him, or, you know, I gotta rewire my thinking, all these phrases, right? So the term rewiring, okay, is literally correct, right? So some of you may have heard this before, but we all have in our brains synapse and synaptic connections. And those synaptic connections in our brain is what builds memory and habits. So every habit we have is based on building basically connections. And so our synapses, when we have a habit, or we read something, or we gain knowledge, or we're used to something being the same place all the time, right? And it's one of the reasons why we're we're basically, as real estate professionals, we basically help people through change, right? And so change includes like, well, the toaster used to be over here. The new house now it's going to be over there. But because I'm used to the toaster being over here, that's a synaptic connection. That's what I'm used to, okay? My muscle memory, right, or my synaptic connection, right, has me going to the toaster over here. So when we're concerned about the future and something's going to change, that's in opposition to our synaptic connections. So for every single habit, so now during the day, if you want to kind of take a little experiment, look at every single thing you do, and at some level, it's formed a synaptic connection. We'll get into this a little bit further, but there are estimates that the average person has somewhere between 12 and 60,000 thoughts a day. 80% of those thoughts are the same. If it takes 3 to 4 weeks to either develop or dissolve a habit, okay, then you can see where if you're thinking the same thing 60,000 times a day, you can see where that synaptic connection gets stronger, because the more you think about something, the more you have the same thought, the more you do the same thing, it creates a stronger connection. And so when we're looking to change our habits, it's not changing our habits, it's really dissolving the habits, because what you're trying to do is, it might take 3 or 4 weeks to, let's say, you want to give up sweets, right? Well, the reason why it's hard is because you can't do it in a day. It takes somewhere between 3 or 4 weeks on average, because you have to dissolve that synaptic connection. And that's one of the reasons why change is so difficult, is because we have literally wired ourselves in a certain way. Now, converse of that is that we can unwire ourselves. So we have the power, we have the control to be able to do that. I think that's one of the important things to get out of the next 5 days, is that all of this is within our control if you understand how it works, and then you can coach yourself through it. So every single thing we do is based on a synaptic connection at some level, right? So let's talk about the heart for a minute. So the brain has its synaptic connections. The brain calculates, but the heart feels. And so if you think about it in terms like this, like no one ever says to you, oh, that was really a brain felt thank you. Like no one ever says that. It's a heartfelt thank you, right? So the magnetic field around the heart is 5,000 times stronger than that of the brain. And it's 100, and the electrical field is 100,000 times stronger than the brain, okay? So the brain is basically a memory bank of the past, okay? But the heart feels its way through things. And we'll get into a little bit in, I think, day 3, we'll get into a little bit of the heart-brain connection, okay? So they do different things. It isn't that the brain sends signals to the heart. Really, the heart sends signals to the brain. And here's how you know this. Now think about this, and we've all had this experience. So somebody presents something to you, and it makes overwhelmingly logical sense that you should do it. And you look at it, and you go, I'm not sure. It doesn't feel right. How many times have we all said, it doesn't feel right? Well, that feeling, okay, isn't coming from here, it's coming from here, okay? So the heart feels its way through things, and it can feel things before the brain can calculate it. So it's really like, your heart is really like the scout. It's always out ahead of you, and it can always feel what's going on. And so emotions like gratitude, love, care, appreciation, compassion, right? Those are higher level emotions, okay? Then you take lower level emotions, anger, frustration, jealousy, things like that. You know, those are lower level. But yet the heart always knows. And so I think we get, you know, we're very much in a left brain, right brain world where it's binary. Something's either right or wrong, okay? Or it's black or it's white, or it's yes or it's no. And the brain does a really good job of cataloging that, okay? Where the heart actually is what helps you navigate it. And that's the difference between the two. So the next time you look at something and you say, you know, it just doesn't feel right, okay? Give it a couple hours, maybe a couple days. right? For things to catch up, because your heart will feel things before you actually will be able to see the reason why. It's a pretty fascinating process to go through. It's really a lot of fun, because if you can just pause long enough, don't put pressure on yourself to make a decision, and just say, well, okay, well, you know what? This doesn't feel right, then it just doesn't feel right. And let's see what happens. Okay, so next, what you think about, you bring about. That's actually a quote, which I didn't know, from a gentleman named Tom Dooley. I like his work quite a bit. And you hear this present itself in a lot of ways. So the other picture I have underneath that quote is energy flows where attention goes. We've all heard these expressions, but it's literally true, because whatever we focus on is what we manifest. So if we're sending out the signal that, oh, I don't know, I can't be a good athlete. Well, you're not going to be a good athlete. If I focus on learning how to do something, well, you're going to learn how to do it. And again, so going back to the other things we've talked about, like being able to, trust your heart and understanding, the difference between the brain and the heart. This is a matter of being able to focus on those things and understanding that wherever I put my attention is where I'm going to get results. So if I put my intention on being better at change management or being more flexible in my thinking, you put your attention on that, then those are the results that you're going to get. And there's so much truth in that. We've all experienced it, because all of us are experts at more than one thing. And it's because we have an interest in it. So if you take a look at somebody who's interested in golf, I've never played golf my entire life, but somebody who plays golf and they're really interested in it, you know what? They're probably pretty good at it. So next, let's talk about curiosity in our current state. So when we're curious about what's going on around us, we move through 3 different states. You've got surviving, living, and thriving. And they are 3 separate conditions, and we've all been in all of them. And as we're going through all this, remember, there is no right or wrong. All we're doing here in this next 5 days is just talking about perspectives and how do we take perspectives and that we're going to learn over the next 5 days, and others you're going to develop, because we're going to have conversations. It's going to lead you into a certain direction, totally independent of this. You're going to have some aha moments. You're going to go, oh, right, that's why that happened, right? So there is no right or wrong. It's all about gaining perspective. Surviving, living, and thriving. So, when you're in survival mode, and we've all been there, you feel a little out of control, and you don't have a lot of abundance. Things are just hard. Then if you're in just the living mode, okay, well, you're in a little more control, and there's a little more abundance. Thriving is letting go of control and allowing abundance. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about control, perspectives, observations, and things like that. Because what you want to be able to do, and hopefully what we'll be able to journey through in the next 5 days, is being able to put yourself in a perspective where you are observing and you're allowing the opportunities to come to you, as opposed to having a very narrow focus. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. So an Einsteinian quote, which is one of my favorites, is that we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we use to create them. So wherever we are today is based on thinking that we had at some other time in the past. Now, if we want to change where we are today, we can't use the same thinking that we used in the past to get here. So now what we have to do is we have to develop different thinking to go from here to where we want to go, because we can't use the same thinking. And that's really critical, because, and again, we've all done this. It's using the same tools, the same thinking. So look at your thinking as like a tool, right? And so we're basically trying to use a hammer when what we really need is a screwdriver, right? So I used a hammer to get where I am today, but today to go next, I need a screwdriver. And so that's about changing the thinking. I think that's really important to understand, because what happens is that all we're doing is forcing things. All we're doing, where we're using the same thinking in the past that got us to where we are today, all we're doing is forcing stuff. And that just doesn't work, okay? and you get exhausted. And then what happens is that you're like, you know what, I just can't do it. So my PowerPoint here is locked up. Well, let's see here. There we go. So when we move from our thinking of the past to where we are today, right? We've changed our thought process. And once we've changed our thought process, we really rarely go back to what we knew. Very difficult. And you've all heard this, right? Once a mind, this expression, once a mind is stretched, it doesn't go back to its original size. And that's what that process is between saying, well, okay, here's where I was. It got me to where I am. Maybe there's nothing wrong with where I am, but I want to go someplace else. I've got to use a different thought process. So abundance or scarcity. Now, when we have an open mind, then we have all sorts of options in front of us because we haven't narrowed our focus. Now, the problem, like with control, is that once we're like, and we've all done this, right? We all do it. Once we're focused on like this thing, or we want this outcome, the problem with that is that we haven't opened up our thinking to other possibilities that might be better. Because even though our dream outcome is this, well, maybe there's something better than our dream outcome. And unless we have an open mind, we won't know that. Because an open mind gives us peripheral vision. We can look to the left and we can look to the right. We can see what other opportunities are around us. If, and this is where the expression tunnel vision comes from, if we're just focused on one outcome, okay, then we lose that peripheral vision. And then we miss all the other opportunities that might be infinitely better than the one that we were originally thinking about. And that's what a closed mind does. A closed mind basically doesn't allow for endless possibilities. It leaves you with very few, if any, other outcomes, other than either the one you thought you wanted, or maybe even something less than that. Because when you're closed-minded, you've narrowed your options. Immediately as you narrow your options, okay, your optimal option becomes the very best. Everything else is probably less than. When you have an open mind, all of a sudden you have that outcome that you originally envisioned, but maybe you have a whole bunch of other ones that are even better. And so I have some recommended reading for everybody if you want, some books and some authors on the other end when we get through this section. But think about everything as open mind and closed mind. So an open mind is a lot like, really it's a lot like a river with a lot of branches. And so if you can kind of imagine with me for a minute that you're on a river and you're in your own little bubble and you're floating down the river. And then all of a sudden, you can go straight, or you could take a left or a right. And so you take a left. Now you're going straight down that left part of the river, that left-hand turn in the river. And then from there are other turns. Okay, I can go left again, I can go right again, or I can go straight. And that's really what looking at opportunity is like. And that's really about what change is. Change is really presenting you opportunities. It's simply a matter, are we going to open up our thinking so that we can see what they all are? And I'll talk just a little bit briefly about this period of time when we're done. And so if you think about yourself as riding that river of change, because it's going to bring you to places where that you really never thought of. And like, for instance, you know, who would have ever thought that we would be getting as many unseen offers, you know, offers on houses that people haven't looked at yet. I mean, we've got a survey of that, which Ed will be giving us at 1 o'clock. And it's pretty amazing. So you really never know. And if you close your mind, okay, then you're basically on that one-way path on that river, and you're really never going to know what all the options are. Right? One metaphor that I really like is that we've all driven at night, and we can go 100 feet at a time in a car at night, perfectly comfortable. We can drive for hours. and not know what's in front of us around the next 100 feet or around that curve or over that hill. And that's a little bit like the journey of change is like. It's always 100 feet at a time. And when we try to project too far into the future, that is again where we miss the opportunity. So we are conditioned at some level as adult drivers that we can drive 100 feet at a time at night, not knowing where we are, and be perfectly fine. Because as that turn hits us, we make the turn, and we do it effortlessly. As we go up the hill, it's effortless, right? And so that's what the process of change is. You're really only going 100 feet at a time because you really don't know. So, and again, when we start to try to narrow down and reduce change and try to control it too much, what happens is that we end up narrowing our possibilities. So I've got this chart for you to help kind of analyze thinking about curious and not so curious. So if I'm a not so curious person, I feel overwhelmed and worried about the future. If I'm a curious person, I feel curious and excited about the future. You know, if you talk to an athlete or any type of performer before they go on stage or before their athletic event, and you ask them how they're feeling, they're going to tell you they're excited. Okay? They're not nervous, they're excited. But you can ask other people about making a presentation or something like that, and they're going to say they're nervous. Well, here's the thing. Being nervous and excited are exactly the same physiologically. It's simply a matter of how you frame it. So about change, are you excited about the future? Are you curious about it? If you're not so curious, it doesn't feel like you're in control, and it lacks creativity. If you're very curious, you think creatively about ways to influence things that are in your control. If you're not so curious, blame others for the environment around you. We're going to spend a lot of time about victim or beneficiary. Which one are you? If you're curious, you're absorbed. You've absorbed in your own emotions and the drama. If you're not so curious, you tend to use reactive language like I can't, I have, if only, right? All negative. If you're curious about things, I can, I will, I prefer. If I'm not curious, you feel like you're a victim. And if you're curious, you're a beneficiary, right? Something good's going to happen to me in this process. If you're somebody who's not curious, you will believe that you're not responsible and that you have no choice. If you're a curious person, you have choices, and you know you do, and you're going to be looking for what those best choices are. And then lastly, if you're not curious, you focus your efforts on things over which you have little control over. And if you're curious, it's just the opposite. You're focusing on the things that you do have control over and the things that you can influence. So again, you'll get this PowerPoint, but these are just give you some perspectives about the difference when you're in a curious condition and a not so curious condition. Love this quote, and I'm not really familiar with Bill Murphy Jr., but he had a whole bunch of quotes and they were great. And this one I grabbed, I think I sent it out to everybody last week, is that today is tomorrow's yesterday and there's no time for regret. There's only time for presenting tomorrow's regret. And how many times do we do that, right? So today is going to be tomorrow's yesterday. So we really don't, so if we don't want to have a regret tomorrow, we got to take care of things today. We got to take care of our business today. I think that's a really good perspective to have, because if we procrastinate, procrastination is really a form of fear. Fear change. So if we want things to be different, we have to make them different now, the present moment. So some recommendations for you. So one thing I would recommend, and you can start this for the rest of this week or whenever it's convenient for you, start a journal. I journal every day. I keep all my notes and all that in my journal. I find it immensely helpful. So start a journal. There are a few works here that I would recommend. One is Mindset by Carol Dweck, very good book, short read, but it's basically all about how you set your frame of mind. And she gets into a lot of athletes and top performers. Breaking the Habit of Being You by Dr. Joe Dispenza. This book's been around for a while. He's one of my favorites. It's very good. It's very, very good. And he also has a TED Talk about change, which is TED Talks are typically 17 minutes. You can go to YouTube and find it. And then lastly is Daring Greatly by Brene Brown. So, you know, these are works if you want to get started. And these are things you can use throughout this whole series this week. They'll be applicable for everything that we do this week. And, you know, you can get them as audiobooks too. So now, before we go, because we're just about at that 9:30 mark, I want you to just take a minute. I'm going to look at the chats while you guys do this. I want you to just take a minute and write down an event in recent memory that caused you concern. So a change event that ended up better than you thought. Now, it could be something small, could be something large, could be you, could be somebody else. But just take 2 minutes and write that down. That's probably the benefit of having a journal. And then we'll come back in just a second. Okay, well, we didn't have much for chats, and it was just really more answering my sound check. So a couple things real quick before we go. If you have any questions anytime during the week that we have these classes, these sessions, and you want to talk about anything privately, you can call or text me. You guys know how to get a hold of me. And anything we would talk about would be completely confidential, but I'm happy to have some private conversations. Tomorrow, we're going to get into understanding you. We're going to get into more of the physiology, how the brain works, how we've been conditioned over thousands of years to do the things we do. And we'll use that as a foundation for how we go forward. So let me just see here. I got one more. Yeah. Yeah, Christine Callahan said Joe Dispenza is my favorite. Yeah, he's really my favorite too. And he's got great YouTube videos on there. And his books are good too. I do mostly audio because of my driving and exercise and all that. So, all right, guys, really good to be with you. And we have a kind of a busy day today. I'll see everybody, those of you who can make it, at 1 o'clock. Take care.